Hello, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I'm here with Dr. Jordan Cooper. I think everyone on this channel knows who you are, but go ahead and introduce yourself anyway.
Oh yeah, sure. Dr. Jordan Cooper, I host a YouTube channel that's just under my name, but I also am the executive director of an organization called Just and Sinner, and our mission is to promote classical Lutheran theological and philosophical education. And so we do that through a publishing house that we run, reprinting old Lutheran books as well as printing new texts, and through my weekly podcast and some other initiatives as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and all of us have actually very much benefited from your work. So we're all
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I also teach Lutheran dogmatics at the
yeah,
American Lutheran Theological Seminary. I should mention it as well.
great. Well, I'm interviewing you over your book, your newly released book, Makers of the Modern Mind: A Guide to Thinkers Who Formed the Modern Left. So just right off the bat, I just to say I was really impressed with your command of the sources, just reading
Oh, well, thanks.
because it's rare that I find a kind of intellectual history in general. I'm kind of averse to the project of intellectual history.
Yeah, I get
So
that.
because it's rare that I find people handle the sources well. So, but I think you did, which is actually which was great for, for me to read through. That doesn't happen often. So go ahead and explain the overall project of your book and give a defense of the kind of intellectual history you're doing, because it's
Mhm.
different than the kind of intellectual history someone like Carl Truman does.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And I do have an endorsement from Truman on the back of this book here. Yeah, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about kind of what led me to write this book in the first place, which is why I have the kind of structure that I have in this text, and that is I was for a period of time. I was for 7 years. I worked at Cornell University with students. I wasn't hired by the university, but I was essentially doing chaplaincy work there with students, and I also got involved in the more conservative student groups on campus, and I was a regular speaker at various events. And I just found that I had a lot of conversations with students who had a lot of questions about the methodologies that were being used in the classroom, certainly from those who were on the left of the academy. And that's kind of what motivated my deeper dive into some of these sources than I had done previously. Not that I was totally unaware of these sources. And so that led me then to try to formulate a series of talks that were going to go up on the YouTube channel that would just kind of overview some of these issues and some of these figures. And I did that, and I started doing that, and then the more that I did, and the more that I read, the more I realized this is probably like a project that could become much bigger than that, and it may be something worth putting into a book. And I had a number of people tell me that they felt like that would be helpful. So that's really what led me to do this. Now, the nature of this project, it's not primarily a critique, and there is some of that in there, so it's not like I don't offer critique at all. But it's not, in other words, like something like Roger Scruton's "Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands" of Thinkers of the New Left. So there's certainly some parallels between this book and that particular textbook, but that's really a critique of leftist academia. This is more an attempt to just trace the primary figures. So what I'm not doing is just tracing, say, a theme and how that theme develops throughout history. Say like expressive individualism, which is
Yeah,
kind of in Truman's Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. That's the primary thread that he's
yeah,
kind of weaving throughout there. But I just wanted to go thinker by thinker and say, let's go look at thinkers in the kind of in their own context, in their own right, examine each of them specifically, without just jumping to the, well, this caused this, caused this, caused this, therefore they're at fault for this, which is what a lot of intellectual history does. Now, by saying that, I don't mean that there isn't, you can't find, causation from one thinker to the next. But I also think it is a bit unfair in the way that we treat things sometimes, where we just want to find a figure to blame and just, blame them for something that develops, 300 years after their writing or something. Um, so it's more thinker by thinker.
yeah.
And within those thinkers, though, you do have a lot of common themes. And so my hope is that as you read this book and as you learn about these thinkers, that you are going to see those themes that do develop from one thinker to the next. And so there is a bit of a kind of genealogy here. But I also think it's important to take thinkers on their own terms as
Yeah.
well. I tried to do both of those things. I don't know how well I did it. I appreciate your comments though, and so I hope I did that okay. I will say from the lectures that I gave to the book is much better than the lectures. I'll just say,
Yeah.
and I say that
Yeah.
just because when you're and this this because you do this on YouTube, like when you're working out ideas, I just have to have stuff to say, and I'm reading new things all the time. But when you're writing, you really have to delve into sources, and
Yep.
it's not that I didn't delve into sources before. You have to be a lot more careful about your
Yep.
language, get to revise it over and over again. So this book was rewritten in its entirety about 3 times.
Yeah. Wow.
So uh, I kept encountering new sources and reading other sources, and so it took a long time.
Yep.
This is a few-year project, and so this is definitely the most intensive book that I've done in terms of just the reading and editing process,
Yeah.
with a lot more than usual. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it shows, and I think you did a really good job. So I wanted to start with one of the figures you mentioned at the beginning of the book, Pierre Charon.
Yeah.
And why is so he's a Roman Catholic. Now you typically hear the narrative that the Reformation caused secularism, and there's a line from Luther to transgenderism. Why is Pierre Charon significant for you in starting your project there and tracing the trajectory of the modern left?
Yeah, I think that's important for a lot of more conservative intellectual histories. You often have Luther or the Reformation as really the villain of Western civilization, and you have this kind of direct line that's tied to all the way from Luther to postmodernity. That you have this kind of loss of authority, adoption of nominalism, a loss of virtue ethics, a loss of participatory metaphysic, and all this kind of stuff. None of that is true, by the way, but that's how the popular narrative plays itself out. And unfortunately, you find that even among very well studied academics, just kind of repeating things that they've heard other places, which gives this kind of veneer of respectability to these kinds of narratives. Pierre Charon is a really significant figure because he really is. Again, I never want to just say this guy's to blame or something, but he precedes Descartes, and he also plays a significant role in the formulation of early rationalism with Descartes and a number of others. And so one could say that he kind of gets the ball rolling in many ways in terms of the development of modern rationalism with Descartes and then everything that kind of follows him. Charon was a French Jesuit. And that's pretty significant because he is the most influential skeptic of the kind of immediate post-Reformation era. And Charon has this very strong divide between the function of reason and the acceptance of authority, the authority of the church. And so you have a really much more significant divide between faith and reason in someone like Charon than you get at any of the reformers. And so Charon writes this book, La Sagesse, and in this text, he formulates a philosophy that's essentially defined by the the hesitancy to make any judgments about anything, pauke. And so he says that wisdom, and he's taking this from Socrates, but he has a kind of weird take on Socrates. Socrates makes this very famous statement that the wise man is the one who admits that he knows nothing. Now, traditionally, a lot of people interpret that as, well, that's where the search for philosophy begins. You try to find the truth. You have this process of seeking, not just assuming that you already know it, but seeking for truth. And Charon takes that in a different direction and essentially says, well, true wisdom is found in the withholding of judgment. And so he's going to say that, well, there are good arguments for all sorts of things. And he presents good arguments for all sorts of things. You've got arguments for, this is true when you look at, just people that watch your channel, are people that are, interested in kind of inter-theological debates, right? And if you take that as your example, well, you've got a lot of very smart, very articulate people who know history, know scripture well, who have different views on things. Well, one could simply say, well, if there are good arguments for this and good arguments for this, maybe I can't really come to a knowledge of the truth anyway. And then maybe I'll kind of commit to something, but I'll do it in a pretty loose way. And kind of withholding some kind of absolute claim that I actually hold on to the truth. So that's essentially Sharon's project,
Mhm.
and this project is very influential on a lot of different people. There are other Jesuits that follow Sharon's methodology here, and then he has a huge impact on the Jansenists, which are an interesting group. But
Mhm.
um, Pascal would be the most famous example of someone who's really influenced by Sharon in his
Mhm.
apologetic. But Descartes is essentially really trying to answer Sharon. And
Mhm.
so what happens with Descartes is he kind of assumes the starting point for Sharon. And Sharon's starting point is that we should essentially reject all of our foundational assumptions of the world. Like
Yeah.
think about reality as if those things were not true. Don't assume anything to be true.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
for Sharon, when you go through this rational process, you can never really through reason alone, which is part of why you need the authority of the church because you can't really
Right.
know anything. So we need to rely on the church. So
Right.
this actually helps a lot of Jesuits start to use this to defend papal claims. But
Yeah.
then they say, well, we can't know the world. And so we have to trust somebody. So we got to trust the Pope.
Yep.
Very different kind of reasoning, I think, than Roman Catholics would use today, but it was something that happened at this time. So Descartes shares the starting point, and he wants to prove that we actually can know through our rational processes that some things are definitively true and some things are false.
Yeah.
So this, when you look at Sharon, you start to realize that Descartes, he's certainly not a skeptic, and people often assume that Descartes is this methodological skeptic. He's really not. Um, he's trying to actually counter skepticism through their own methodological, um, system,
Yeah.
essentially. And this is where Descartes comes up with his famous, I think, therefore I am, which becomes this kind of indisputable starting point for all knowledge. That the one thing that we can definitively know is our own existence, and then you build from that certain principle a series of other ideas, and through rational argumentation, you can achieve some kind of certitude about all sorts of things about reality. But
Mhm.
with Sharon, that you really get that major shift to the skeptical posture in engaging the world.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and I do think that's relevant for modern the online space, as you know, the online space of Protestant polemics and Roman Catholic
Yeah,
polemics a lot of times does not mirror the academic space. So
not at
someone
all.
like Sheben or Garrigou Lagrange would not use. They would say no, Protestants can have a rational confidence; they just can't have
Mhm.
divine faith, which is a different conversation.
Yep.
But interestingly, at the time of recording, Trent Horn just released a video talking about why sola scriptura, is the self-refuting thing if Protestants use different evidences to support the inspiration of different books, and why, well, that only gives you probability, so you can't know, without the authority of the church that a given book is inspired. How do contemporary polemics, which seem to follow more on the heels, at least in the online space, the resonance seems to be more on the heels immediately in the Reformation rather than on contemporary sort of scholarly discussions that are going about. How does someone's rhetoric, like someone you see in Sharon, how does that find an echo in this sort of argument that, well, Protestants can't really know what books are inspired if they're just deducing evidences for what books are inspired?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good connection to make. And there is this vast difference between Roman Catholic scholarship and then what happens in online polemics. And this is true all over the place. For example, you saw this with there was some blow up with people going after Gavin Ortland for using terminology that was like everyone uses in
Yeah.
scholarship. You see this all the time, and I share these frustrations with Gavin because I see this with him all the time. Is that people go after him, and he's just saying things that are just standard in
Right,
scholarship.
right.
And,
Yep.
and so, yeah, I think in many ways it is true that online Roman polemics does mirror the post-Reformation era polemics much more than it does the actual theology of in the academy
Right.
in the Roman Church, certainly post Vatican II. Yeah, and so I think that there is oftentimes this desire for some principle of absolute certitude, the kind of absolute epistemic foundationalism, where you have to have the certainty of some kind of principle of knowledge, or really you can't know anything at all.
Yeah.
Which I just think, and that does come from Sharon. That's very much what Descartes does. And yeah, when you're using that kind of argument of, well, Protestants don't have any certainty because they can only have probability. Well, everybody functions on the basis of
Yeah.
probability in every area of life.
Yep.
We don't function on the basis of certitude, and we don't have great anxieties about that in any other area of life. I think it's an impossible standard that Rome sets here, but also yes, you're submitting to an authority that supposedly gives you absolute knowledge of this or that, but at the same time, you still have to use your own rational process
Mhm.
to weigh the probability of Roman Catholic claims versus, say, Eastern
Yep.
Orthodox claims
Yep.
or the claims of the Coptic Church or whoever. And so there's really no escape from this. And I think it presents a standard that is an impossibility and functionally one that nobody actually uses.
Yep. Yep.
Right. So
Yep.
so if think just for example, like if you and this is my kind of go-to example of this, and that is if you if you if you're at somebody's house and you see a chair and they offer you a seat, well, do you have 100% certitude that that seat actually will hold your weight? Like, do you like check the seat and look at the structure of it so you can just make sure that it's really going to hold you? Well, no, you
Yep.
just sit in it, and your certainty was maybe based on probability. Your experience of sitting in many seats
Yep.
has given you the just general trust that when you sit in a seat, it's generally going to hold your weight.
Yep.
And that's what we do with all scientific truths.
Yep.
I mean, that's even what we do with like just basic assumptions we make about the world. You can't definitively prove that the world didn't begin 5 minutes ago.
Yep.
You can't definitively, with 100% certitude, prove that your childhood was not just, these false memories implanted in your brain and you're in the matrix or something. Like, but nobody's worried about that.
Yep.
So I think probability is fine, and I think we function based on probabilities, and I think that's just how our minds work.
Yeah.
You have different kinds of probabilities, of course. You can have so I would say you can have a near certainty based on
Yep.
probability, so you're not worried about something, versus the kind of probability where you're like, it's 51% chance this could be right or 49% wrong. Well, okay, maybe then you got some worries or anxieties about it, but
Yeah. Yep.
yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
that has to be the case.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. Now, with Pierre Chiron's, we can call it a kind of, if I think, and I think you would agree, like a kind of polemics of certitude
Yeah,
that he
sure.
sort of resources against the Reformation.
Yeah.
That sort of polemics of certitude at least seems to create an intellectual context in which someone like Descartes arises, and he
Yeah.
tries to then give this sort of method by which he can have certain knowledge. So trace that line. How does Chiron set the stage for someone like Descartes, who I believe was a Roman Catholic as well?
Yeah.
I think. And how does he set the stage for Descartes? And then how does that sort of polemics of certitude, which sets the stage for an epistemology of certitude, then set the stage for kind of the innovations of liberalism that you trace in the book?
Yeah, sure. So this all kind of begins with this desire to have some kind of absolute certitude of some epistemic starting point. And for Chiron, you're just not going to have that when it comes to the natural world. You can really only have that when it comes to dogma, and that's just whatever the church proclaims.
Yep.
And that even in and of itself doesn't really address the issue, because it still does not address what those dogmatic claims actually are. Literally any time in Roman Catholic scholarship, not just people on the internet that pretend that things are certain.
Yeah.
That
Which is why Scheeben drops that argument. Like Scheeben doesn't use that argument, which is interesting. It becomes the Protestants can't have divine faith. It's a completely different conversation.
It's a completely different argument. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So then you get with Descartes, and you said he was a Roman Catholic. He was. I don't think, some people say that, well, he was in the Netherlands, so therefore he must have been Protestant or something. There's no indication of that. I don't know that Descartes was that religiously committed one way or another, to be honest. I don't know, at least as far as I've been able to tell and what I've read in secondary sources, and maybe there's something I don't know about that plays into this. But I don't know that he was that concerned with those issues really at all. But Descartes' influence was really prominent throughout Europe. And so you find Cartesians, not a lot of them in Germany, initially at least, but you do get irrationalism growing a while later. But you have plenty of Cartesians in France. He has a significant influence there. There's an influence in Italy. So you find Cartesians all over the place in one way or another. And many of them are Roman Catholic. They're not all. He has a very strong following in the Netherlands, especially if you're looking at Protestants, among some of the Dutch Reformed or who were Reformed, I guess, to move things in a very different direction. So I think you asked specifically what about
liberalism
and how that ties into like
so how does the polemics of certitude set the stage for some of the innovations of liberalism? And then how do those innovations set the stage for people like Marx? So we'll start with sort of the innovations of liberalism. How does the certitude set the stage for the innovations of liberalism?
Yeah, I think that's it's a good question, and you do see this in someone like Thomas Hobbes, and let's just take Hobbes as your father of liberalism. Really, what I found, especially more recently, as I'm delving into 17th century sources, is everybody cites Grotius. I mean, Grotius is really the major figure, not Hobbes. Hobbes becomes a major figure, but it seems, at least as far as I can tell at this time, that Grotius, I mean, he's the one that's kind of driving Hobbes' whole argument, really. But at least in an English-speaking context, kind of Grotius maybe is filtered through Hobbes. But let's take Hobbes. So Hobbes is often, if you take a political philosophy course in a university, at least in the English-speaking world, you're usually going to read Hobbes and Locke as kind of your two key figures for the development of political liberalism. Now, Hobbes, he had a theology. His theology is extremely bizarre. I mean, really out there, really weird. He believes that souls are material, that God is material, that everything's material. It's really odd stuff that you find in Hobbes.
He's a theistic physicalist.
He was, yes. Yeah. And an absolute determinist. I mean, he was. I believe that everything essentially functioned on pure, physical, mechanical processes, including human actions. So, an interesting figure. But Hobbes is dealing with the issue of competing religious ideologies, just like everybody is at this time. And, so you get competing religious claims. You've got the Reformed, the Lutherans, and then you have the Roman Catholics. Obviously, in England, you have the Anglicans versus then you have the Puritans. And so you've got these competing ideas of what is right or wrong and how the state should be governed relative to the branch of Christianity that one holds to. And so Hobbes looks at these competing claims and essentially comes to the conclusion, though he has his own theology, he comes to the conclusion that you can't have certitude about anybody's religious claims. Much like Sharon is going to say, but not so much about theology, but he applies this in that realm. And so he essentially says, well, nobody really knows what's right and what's wrong. You've got all these people writing polemical texts and everybody's read a lot and everybody's smart and they're all arguing different things. So we actually can't achieve certitude at all in what we know. And so then he's going to say, well, what we need then is we need to have some principle that underlies the authority of the state that is not based upon certitude of religious or theological commitments at all. Okay, so that's where then he's going to come up with this notion that the purpose of the state is really the preservation of rights, but not really rights. I mean, he's going to say basically one right, and that is the right to preserve your life. And so what he essentially provides is a non-theological approach to the state that is, achieved through this social contract, essentially that affirms the preservation of life. And then he's going to say, well, if we can't have any certitude, much like some of the Jesuit polemicists do, he's going to say, well, we just need a source of authority that's going to tell us what to think. But instead of looking at Rome, looking at the Pope, he's going to say that's the magistrate. And so the magistrate, that's where we find our certitude. And so then he goes on to say, really, well, you're not really at fault if the religion is wrong and the magistrate gives you the wrong religion. That's the magistrate's fault. So you don't really have to worry about it. It's almost like kind of implicit assent to the doctrine of the church that you find in Rome. It's a very similar thing you find in Hobbes. And so, they're very much connected. It's this attempt to find a point of absolute certitude. And when you can't find it, then you just have to, preserve the right for people to think whatever they want. Certitude is impossible to find.
I thought that was fascinating because that in your book, I didn't consider that just ever. I've read Leviathan before. I hadn't ever made that parallel before. that emerges when you put those figures together, that
Yeah.
what Hobbes is doing is actually finding a kind of alternative to the magisterium in the
Yeah.
magistrate, who just kind of then enforces by power his will on the state. But then you realize that pattern of sort of belief enforcement is actually like that actually is a similar pattern we've seen before. Now Hobbes has
It
just
is.
relocated it to the magistrate because he sort of buys this polemics of certitude, and the magistrate then, instead of the magisterium, has the right to sort of politically enforce beliefs.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Exactly.
I thought that was fascinating. So how would you connect then, like someone like Hobbes, because you grouped together Hobbes, Locke, and Grotius. So yeah, what sort of connects those figures together?
Yeah, well, Grotius is really the primary foundational figure, and Grotius, he's an Arminian theologian, and he's
Mm,
largely known as a theologian, not just as a political thinker. And he's probably the most influential of the Arminian theologians.
mm,
And so, he's known far beyond just his political theory, but essentially, he wants to find a non-theological ground for government altogether.
mhm.
And so, at least Grotius's claim is that his approach to the state would remain valid even if God did not exist. And
Mm,
Grotius says this quite explicitly.
mm,
Now, Grotius is not saying that he thinks that's the case.
mm, mm.
He's basically sure that that's not the case, but he's saying
Yeah,
even if it was. So he wants to have a non theological ground for the state in order to preserve some sense of liberty and stability. Now, I think also it's easy for us to like look back on that and say like, okay, well, thanks for secularizing the West, uh, but at the same time, we've never lived through a 30-year war.
yeah,
We've never lived through a situation where competing religious claims mean death all around you and
yep,
and just continual war. So this and it's not like the Reformation is just to blame for that
yep,
either.
yep,
Um, but these religious wars in some sense lead to a necessity of rethinking the relation between the the church and the state, or
yep,
what is the kind of theological foundation for the state, or is there a kind of bare minimum theological foundation that we need to have, or is there some clear distinction between the theological foundations of, say, the church, and then the state is something that can be derived through pure reason.
yeah,
And so Grotius is really the one that looks at the preservation of life as the primary purpose of the state.
yeah,
Uh, and I do want to say, to some degree, like that's not false. I think
mm,
there are certain ways of conceiving of that could be, but like Martin Luther, for example, and he's certainly not one who holds to a secular state, not in the modern sense. What
mm,
that means. But he's going to say that is the root. The preservation of life is the foundation of the state. Well, we get that from the narrative of Genesis, where he's going to say that you get this, fight between, Cain and Abel, where Cain murders his brother, and then God places this mark of protection on Cain and establishes the law when he says that if someone sheds your blood, his blood is going to be shed. So now that there is a civic punishment if you take life, and then
yeah,
Genesis reiterates this to Noah. So I want to say, I think biblically there is a foundation for this. That's kind of the most important thing that the state does. It protects life.
yeah,
And so it's not like Grotius is completely novel. In other words, the novelty lies in basically removing the theological foundation of what that means.
yeah, yeah,
Okay, so then you get Grotius influences Hobbes, and then you get John Locke that comes out of this. Now, Locke is generally considered the most important figure for liberal political philosophy. Like Hobbes, you're not really going to call Hobbes's political philosophy liberal. I mean, in some sense, it's kind of authoritarian,
yeah,
like
yep,
like because he's going to say the magistrate's authority is basically not not absolute in every sense, but in many senses, it's kind of
yeah,
absolute. Like as long as the right to life is preserved,
yep,
then the magistrate can kind of demand whatever he wants of
yeah,
people.
yep,
Um, so Locke is then going to expand upon this notion of right to speak about a number of rights.
yeah,
And so he's going to say that the primary function or purpose of the state is to protect individual liberties or rights.
yeah,
Uh,
yep,
and, and that moves beyond just the preservation of life to things like property ownership and a number of other things as well. And the other element of that is the adoption of the idea of the social contract. And
Mhm.
so the notion here essentially, and maybe just to kind of contrast this to other Christian views. So Locke is writing against Filmer, who's this guy who had a view of the state that was it was kind of like an apostolic succession
Mhm.
of magistrates. It's a very strange view,
Yeah.
and essentially he says that Adam was given this absolute right of kingly authority that was passed on,
Yep.
and so you get this line of authority that's
Mhm.
basically just derived from the
Yeah.
previous magistrate.
Basically through, like, fathers, if I remember right, or
It
something like.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the father becomes a magistrate to the
Yeah.
home. Like there's an
Yeah.
absolute authority that the father is granted in the
Yeah.
family life.
Yeah.
And so that view was very popular at the time. Filmer was very highly regarded. We don't really think about him much today as being
Yeah.
someone of any influence other than in leading to Locke's writing. So Locke is critiquing this idea that the authority of the state is grounded in divine right.
Mm. Hmm.
And he instead says that the authority of the state is grounded in the people, the contract that the people make. And so he essentially says that, um, human beings, for their own self-interest, contract, they make agreements to live in peace and harmony with one another for their own well-being. And in order to do that, they essentially grant authority to some other body, the state, whatever form that takes, so that the authority of the state actually is given from below.
Mm.
And so, especially in England, you see that these debates about where the authority of the state comes from are are always tied to their view of church authority.
Hmm.
And so, those who support the historic episcopacy, they're going to hold to a view more like Filmer's.
Mm.
And then it is largely those who are more like the Puritans who are going to have views that are more like John Locke's.
Hmm.
So these things are really intimately tied together at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Um, Now, how would you sort of then, well, so to ask about that, because if I remember right, Locke himself, I actually learned this from reading your book, was he saw himself as a Puritan, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, of some kind. Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
did.
So that's really interesting. So, um, would you say that there's a line from the sort of position Locke takes in wanting to sort of destabilize, and I think in some ways rightly so, this idea that the father is a kind of magistrate in his own home,
Yeah.
and the king is a kind of absolute monarch, or things like this. Um, is there a line from the way he does that to someone like Hegel or Marx or Gramsci? How would you say that those figures then are connected? What's the line from someone like Locke to Hegel or Marx?
Yeah, that it's kind of hard to draw, to be honest with you. And this is a question that not just I, but many have asked is why is it that by the time you get to the early 19th century, you have these two completely opposed views of the nature of the human being and society. So on the one hand, you have what comes out of some forms, at least, of Lockean political philosophy is an extreme individualism
Mm.
because everything surrounds the protecting of the rights of the individual. Now, I don't. It's not at all fair to call Locke an extreme individualist. I don't think
Mhm.
that's fair.
Mhm.
Um, but many people do end up in that, in that kind of place. So then on the other hand, you get, especially through Hegel and then filtered through Marx, you have this move away from the individual to society as an organic whole.
Mhm.
And so this is the classical philosophical question or problem of the one and the many and how they relate.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, you get those Lockeans who are so focused on kind of the one, the individual. Society is really just a collection of individuals. And then
Mhm.
you have through someone like Hegel, he's going to define world history through what he calls the states,
Mm. Mm.
nations. And he
Mm.
looks at whole nations really as subjects. Now you
Yeah.
can find roots of this in some ways in Kant too, even before you get to Hegel. And then of course you get Karl Marx, who then is influenced by Hegel, and he is going to hold to a very firm collectivism.
Mhm.
So the question of, well, how do we get collectivism and radical individualism as these competing ideologies at the same time that move in kind of polar opposite directions? And to be honest, I'm not exactly sure if I can give you a definitive. I don't know if I can definitively trace. Here's where this develops to
Yeah.
this, other than to say that at least part of it is that throughout history, it tends to be the case that when people move in one particular extreme, people then tend to jump into the opposite extreme.
Mm.
And so if you have this, focus solely on the individual, and then people are going to jump to the collective. Like that's just what people do. But I will say here is at least one common point that you find between certain within the liberal tradition and then Marx. So I use the example of Thomas Paine in the
Mhm.
book,
Mhm.
and Thomas Paine is he's not really a philosopher. He's not an academic, at least.
Yeah.
But he's got all sorts of ideas that are very influential,
Yeah.
and usually most well known in American context for the book Common Sense, which
Yeah.
becomes foundational for the American Revolution. But there's a reason why people don't really read his other writings very often. And Paine has this approach again that's mirrored in others too. He's just maybe the most extreme example of it. Um, that looks at the past with kind of disdain, right?
Yeah.
So you're not looking at the inheritance of the past as a good to be received and developed or improved upon, but you look at the past as something that kind of shackles you, and so you want to throw off the past. And so Paine is going to say, I mean, this is just kind of an absurd argument that he makes, but he essentially says, well, every generation should write their own constitution, like
Yeah.
because he says if essentially you have a constitution that's going to last for many generations, well, that's kind of a slavery by means of the dead. Like the
Yeah.
dead are enslaving you. You're
Yep.
bound to their to the things that they believed and thought were good for society.
Yeah.
And so he contends that every generation needs to have essentially this contract rewritten.
Right.
So,
Right.
so
Which
go ahead.
importantly pushes which importantly pushes against even for people like a Richard Hooker, who is pretty, like, if we're putting him on the political spectrum, pretty conservative politically. Nevertheless wants to say, yes, even if you say consent founds the coherence of a society,
Mhm.
it's not that every generation rewrites the constitution. Every generation just chooses to uphold it by virtue of living under it, rather than rewriting it at
Okay.
every single time, which I think is very different than someone like Paine, who's just essentially is like every generation has to almost reinvent it and take what's good from the past, but you also have to reinvent it.
Yeah, so that's when you get this idea of tacit consent.
Yeah.
And Lockeans generally tend to go there because you have the question if everything is, and I think like in some ways this does, I think, demonstrate one of the difficulties of liberal political philosophy as a whole is
Yeah.
the question of, well, if everything is just by social contract, like why is it that I am under the authority of a social contract that people hundreds of years ago wrote?
Yeah.
Like what? How
Yep.
does this work? And so you get this notion of tacit consent that
Yeah.
Lockeans generally are going to work with, which is, essentially just by living in the society, you're tacitly giving consent to the contract as it is. Yeah,
That's
but
interesting.
Paine goes beyond that. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. 'Cause I wonder if actually Locke quotes Hooker a couple of times in the treatise, in his two treatises. So I'm curious, like, to what extent does he take that idea and kind of? But yeah,
Yeah. So
that
I'm
work.
not an expert in
Yeah.
Hooker at all, but I can tell you that I did come across literature that does make some explicit ties from Hooker to Locke, that does try to
Okay.
make an argument essentially that Locke is following in Hooker's line.
That's real. Yeah, that's real. And I know Locke sees him, at several points. You find like that judicious divine, and he just
Yeah.
quotes something from the laws. So I
Yep.
do think that's fascinating. Now, like, thinking about this idea of um, the polemics of certainty needing to, like, requiring, if you don't have sort of the possibility of the sort of certitude demanded by someone like Sharon, you have then a stated need for a magistrate figure, whether that's the magisterium or someone else, to
Mhm.
enforce their will in the absence of this kind of dogmatic certainty. I wonder to what extent that prepares the way for someone like Marx to essentially view religion and dogma as these sort of instruments of the bourgeoisie to sort of enforce their will on the proletariat. So I'm curious if there's a line there you could speak to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there might be. I mean, obviously, there's some points of connection, at least, or maybe similarity there, but I don't know how to draw a particular genealogical connection. And so I'm always just a bit careful about that, because if
Yes,
I can't
which is
find,
wise.
I'm like, if I can't find a direct influence there,
Yep.
or it doesn't have to
Yep.
be a direct influence, it could be influence on the guy's teacher. Because
Yep.
this is something you see in history too, is sometimes somebody's very obviously influenced by somebody else, but they
Yep.
don't know that because their teacher was, right? But
Yep.
I don't know that in Marx to such an extent that I can really make a really strong tie. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
But very may well be the case. I don't know.
Yeah. I find so when Marx sort of even though I don't think his reading of history is entirely compelling at all, but like I do find it interesting when he treats the Reformation in Das Kapital. I think in the Communist Manifesto, he sees the Reformation as a kind of instance of the sort of thing he's talking about. Which again, I'm like, I don't think that completely works, but I do.
And everybody does that, though. I mean,
Yeah.
Hobbes
Yep.
does the same thing. He tries to like appropriate the Reformation for his ends and really totally misunderstands it, and I think abuses the
Right.
Reformation,
Right.
and Luther in particular. So, but I think especially you get that anybody who is in any way German is going to try to use Luther for their ends. I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
that's it. Even regardless of whether they think that's really the case, that he really supports their views of this or that. I mean, he is a kind of folk hero to the German people. I mean, this is
Yeah.
why the Third Reich did the same thing with Luther, but it's
Yep.
really more just I don't know. I think it's a misappropriation for the sake
Yeah.
of riling the average person up when somebody's kind of a heroic figure in your society.
Yep. Well, and I think one of the evidences that it's a misappropriation is that in sort of the areas influenced by Luther, you have the Lutherans critiquing the Anabaptists in that, like, who kind of are more the political progenitors in some ways of the sort of.
Yeah, I see this and reads that like of Luther as some kind of anti-authoritarian populist figure. Like he's
Yeah.
not at all.
Right.
I think any read of Luther as a populist just can only come if one hasn't read Luther's political writings.
Yep.
I mean, in many ways, Luther's an anti-populist in really strong ways.
Yeah.
He's so firm on the authority of the magistrate. I mean, even in extreme ways, like in ways that I'm like, he went way too far. Something that Melanchthon moderated. So here's the example that I give a lot, because I think it's just kind of a clear one, and Melanchthon differs from him on this. The question of private property, Luther just says, hey, the magistrate owns the property. Everything you belong owns to the magistrate. And if he wants to take anything from you, he can do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
And you have to give it to him. Like the only thing he doesn't have authority of is over the spiritual life. So he can't take away church. You can't take away the sacraments. And so you have to be a faithful Christian, even if you're in a tyrannical state that won't let you preach the gospel, you do it. But anything else, he's going to say the magistrate has the authority to do it. Now, of course, he's also going to really loudly rebuke the magistrates for their abuses. So, this is tempered by that too. So, but he preaches on this a lot. Now, Melanchthon, as I said, differs. Melanchthon's very clear that no, there is such a thing as private property. The magistrate, he explicitly says, the magistrate does not own your property. I think he's showing some clear differences with Luther on that. But and then it's really the Anabaptists that are the populist movement of the Reformation.
Yep. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think you have like someone like Melanchthon affirming the right of private property, the Articles of Religion enshrining the right of private property. Where if one wanted to say the Reformation birthed these figures, the figureheads of the magisterial Reformation rejects either Anabaptism or in the Anglican sort of side of things, rejects and starts to become harsher and harsher towards Puritanism even. So one can't rightly, I'd say, see those things as the heirs of this sort of thing. But in any case, sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent in my own mind. So you mentioned Gramsci was someone I actually learned about from you. I hadn't read his stuff before encountering them in your own talks on Gramsci, and but he seems to have been a major figure in propounding the notion of cultural hegemony. So how trace that line from someone like Marx to Gramsci, and how does then Gramsci set the foundations for this notion of cultural hegemony, which we then see in sort of phrases like heteronormativity or heteropatriarchy or things like that.
Yeah. So we find Gramsci is something that you're going to find in a lot of the Marxists of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And When you read Karl Marx, right? So Marx, he argues for communism, socialism, that is what he calls scientific. So Marx and Engels coined this term scientific socialism.
Yeah.
And scientific socialism, it's not really scientific. There's no scientific methodology about it at all. What they mean by scientific is they're saying that they make this connection between the way that societies develop and the way that any living organism develops.
Mhm.
And so, in some ways, this is taken from Hegel's notion that's also taken from Kant before him, that there is a sense in which a nation or a state can be a subject.
Mhm.
And so, Marx is going to say, well, there's this just as there's this inevitable biological process of the human body as it grows, it's going to do the same things. So, any society that grows and develops is going to have these necessary periods of progress and
Yeah.
growth, just like anything else does. And this is going to come from his materialism,
Yeah.
his metaphysical materialism.
Yeah.
And I know some people try to say that Marx isn't really dependent upon a metaphysical materialism. He just means by historical materialism that he's only talking about the material of history, like economic processes. And it's very obvious that his foundational assumptions are materialist.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yep.
where he departs from Hegel so significantly.
Yeah.
Hegel by himself, like a strong Hegelian philosophy, would never lead you to Marx.
Right. Yep.
If you're
Yep.
honest with
'Cause he's an idealist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that really lies behind everything, I think.
Mhm.
So because he views everything as a material phenomena, well, then it's determined by mechanical processes, and it's just inevitably going to proceed through various stages. There's no real focus at all on human subjectivity,
Yeah.
which is essential for Hegel. And so he's going to say, okay, well, communism is just the inevitable result of the growth of the organism that is the state or society. And so it's going to happen just even without like activism per se. It's going to happen. Like the proletariat's going to recognize their oppression, and there's going to be this revolt, and you're going to have communist states set up all over the place in Europe. And well, by the time you get to 1910, it's like this hasn't happened. And there's no revolt. People have not started to recognize their oppression and tried to overthrow all these states. And because of that, a lot of communists start to rethink this scientific element of Marxism.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that they do is they start to think about the nature of subjectivity and how subjectivity plays a role within Marxism. So you get a couple different major figures here that start to do this. And the two major ones here that I highlight are Lukács and Gramsci. And both of them have very similar ideas. They're developed separately. And so since you asked about Gramsci in particular, he's in Italy. He's a communist activist, and he argues that the problem with classical Marxism is that Marx conceived of society as purely economic relations, and he saw essentially oppression, if you want to use that term, and economic terms, exploitation just in economic terms, so that the bourgeoisie just they kind of exploited people for profit financially.
Yeah.
And he wants to say that, well, the problem is, and he's saying this is why people haven't actually, revolted and had these communist revolutions all over the place, is that the bourgeoisie, they implement their control through hegemonic ideologies.
Hmm.
And so it's through the imposition of the bourgeoisie way of life and values that has essentially pacified the populace.
Mm.
And so there is then this oppression that occurs through all sorts of cultural means. So this could be through religion. This could be through, the arts. This could be through media, the way that the news is reported. These are all kind of mechanisms that can be used by those who are in power to impose their values on a populace. And if you essentially kind of brainwash the populace to think these things are good and normal, then they're pacified. They don't know that they're oppressed, so they're never going to try to overcome their oppression. And so that's what this notion of cultural hegemony comes from, is this idea that you have this structure of ideas that are imposed by the ruling class on the rest of society. And so then for the Gramscian, what you're going to be doing when you're looking at cultural products is you're going to find the hidden idea behind it, right? You're always going to want to find the what is the upper class trying to pacify in me? What kind of ideas, hegemonic ideology is present here?
Hmm.
And so it does lead to a form of criticism of media that or literature or whatever that is always going to be looking for this kind of underlying hidden meaning that's being wrongly imposed on the oppressed classes.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I mean that ties into the sort of semiotic sort of turn that you trace actually in the book. To what extent do you think that's actually a helpful? Because when I like think about the notion that media is a kind of sign that is at least discipling the way we
Mhm.
think. To my mind, I'm like, that actually does sound like an insightful sort of an insightful full reading of what media is actually doing. Now, whether it's like always a tool of trying to enforce hegemonic control, like that's one thing. But um, do you think to what extent can a Christian say, no, that's not totally incorrect? And to what extent can a
Yeah.
Christian kind of integrate that way of analyzing media into kind of more liturgically conscious way of life?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you're right that there is something true in the insight. And I think this is what you find in any of these figures that you're going to look at is that there are going to be things that are true in what they're pointing out.
Yeah,
Right. And I always say if there was nothing true
yeah,
in what these people said, then they wouldn't have any influence because it
yeah,
wouldn't resonate with anybody. So there's always some underlying something that they're getting at that is right,
yeah,
or at least something that they're rightly responding to. Right? There's a genuine error that they're trying to correct or something.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, certainly any cultural products that you make is going to be informed by the values of a culture. Like, of
yeah,
course, that's going to be the case. And it certainly is the case that in every culture, there are inherited values, there are inherited value systems, and your value systems are going to be displayed in the art that a certain culture produces. Christian culture produces a certain kind of art. If you look at classical, Western culture, there are certain values that underlie, the Renaissance
yeah,
or any movement in history. That's just always in Islamic culture. It's going to be the same way. Like you're going to see the values of a culture displayed in the products of that culture. So I certainly don't think that we can just say, well, Gramsci's totally wrong. I mean, it's not an ideologically neutral sphere. There is no ideologically neutral sphere.
yep,
And so Gramsci's right about that, and the Marxists in general are right about that.
yeah,
They are going to say there is this kind of there's no sphere of pure neutrality,
yep,
and this is one of the problems with rationalism.
yeah,
And I think this is what you're going to see that the neo-Marxists in this era get right
yeah,
is that they're all responding to the Enlightenment.
yeah,
And so Adorno, I think, is if I could say, Adorno's my favorite Marxist, but I
hmm,
think I think he's so right in what he's responding to, but he doesn't know the solution to it, right?
hmm,
Um,
hmm,
and what they're looking at is a world which claimed that through pure rational means you could objectively find some truth that is essentially valueless,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Truth devoid of value, which in a
yeah,
Christian perspective that's not a thing. It doesn't
right,
exist.
yep,
It's not just there isn't just this kind of purely propositional truth out
right,
there that has no end in
yeah,
view.
yep,
And so on that point, I think we could say they're right about that. Of course, whatever that end is going to be completely different in
yeah,
either of the systems. But also, and here is a point where I think Christians really can't align at all with his evaluation, is that for many of the Marxists, there was always this assumption of the worst motive in everything that comes through the media.
yeah,
So there's always this assumption that any cultural product is inherently an act of purposeful oppression.
yeah, yeah,
That it's like this manipulation or something, right?
yeah,
So when we say that cultural ideas do flow through the arts, culture, politics, everything else, that doesn't mean a kind of wicked, purposeful imposition of ideas upon
yeah,
people to oppress them, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's a very different. I think that's a very different claim.
yeah, yeah. That's well said. That's well said. Um, Now let's see. So we have a few minutes left here. Um, what can you cover briefly and then I have one more question after that, but briefly, the significance of structuralism, post-structuralism, and how that sets the stage for the deconstruction of gender.
Yeah, well, that's an easy thing to do in a
I
few
know.
minutes. Yeah. Well, and so this is the reason why this book is pretty big, because it's like you need to.
By the way, for my audience, there's so much in this book that I'm just asking questions just to give a broad overview of the book. Jordan does a really good job, just like thinker after thinker after thinker, laying them out really clearly. And there are a bunch of thinkers I skipped over for the sake of time that Jordan covers. So anyway, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
But there are, even when I wrote this book, I'm like, oh, there's so many people I wanted to include, but then I'm like, I just will never end. But this book will never end. It'll never get written. But if I just keep going, but so structuralism really arises because of all these philosophical shifts that take a long time. So if I can briefly explain what happens here, essentially, is that philosophy in the modern world goes through kind of trends, just like any field, right? It goes through trends. There are certain topics that people discuss at certain periods of time. Now, the time of Descartes, people really focus a lot on epistemology, the question of knowledge. And they're doing that because you get the rise of, you get Sharon's questioning, and then Descartes is trying to arrive through the use of reason to these principles of absolute certitude. And then you get Hegel. Hegel kind of brings metaphysics back into a lot of conversations. Kant also writes a lot of metaphysics preceding Hegel. And probably Kant is probably the most significant figure for what becomes what's called the linguistic turn in the 20th century. And that is that people start to ask a lot of questions about kind of the structures of the mind, or the structures of thought that lead to our experience, or how we understand the world around us. The kind of preconditions of knowledge, as Kant talks about. What are those things that we know intuitively that are structures that we use to understand the world around us? Right? When I understand the world, in other words, the world is understood through certain concepts that are already in my mind. And there are all different ways to look at this. What I said is totally inadequate right there. But out of this comes a turn toward language, and people start to understand that, a lot of the ways that we understand the world are essentially derived from the linguistic categories that we have. We think through the language that we have. And the idea that's behind a lot of this is that, if we didn't have certain words for certain concepts, we wouldn't think about those concepts in quite the same way. So people often bring up the fact that there are certain tribes that have been found that don't have, a word for the color blue. Supposedly, and I don't know, I haven't checked the veracity of this claim or anything at all, but at least how it's cited, people say that, they don't really even think about blue as a distinct color. And so if you were to say, and some cultures have a different color for dark blue and light blue. Now, if you have those distinct categories, you start to think about things when you see those two colors differently, right, than you would otherwise. So the language that we use informs the way that we think about the world. And structuralism is a movement that begins with a linguistic philosopher, Ferdinand de Saussure. And Saussure, he doesn't actually write his major work himself, really, but he doesn't publish it, at least before he dies. His students kind of put his lectures together in this book. And essentially, he has a linguistic philosophy that talks about the linguistic structures that we use to understand reality. And he says, so Saussure sees language as this essentially self-contained system in and of itself. And so if you look at, say, classical views of language, someone like Plato, you're going to see that the meaning in language is essentially found in the real referent to which the word points. Like there is an objective validity to what one is saying. So if I say the word justice, the meaning in the term justice is grounded in the fact that justice is real. It's a real form or idea that actually exists outside of my language. And Saussure, and it's not like he's totally original in this, because linguistics have moved in this direction throughout the 19th century. But Saussure is going to say that the meaning of language is really found within the linguistic system in and of itself. And so it's kind of a self-contained type of holistic system. There's something of Hegel in this, that Hegel starts to see things as holistic systems, the totality, as people talk about. And so language is seen as a system of meaning that doesn't derive its meaning from anything external. It really just has meaning in itself.
Mm.
So he likens it to like a game of chess. Now he's going to say that language has certain rules that you have to abide by.
Yeah.
And so he's going to say that it's not purely subjective at all. He's going to say language is kind of the shared, it has these shared linguistic constructs, shared rules of grammar, shared understandings of what words mean. And that's the only way that language functions. So he's going to say you can't create language, you just receive it. You're born into a linguistic community and you essentially have, certain concepts that you need to work with.
That sounds like a predecessor to Wittgenstein, like the later Wittgenstein. But
yeah, there's definitely some similarities with Wittgenstein there as well. Yeah. So these are trends that happen all throughout linguistic philosophy in the 20th century in many ways. And now, for what it's worth, there are also like structuralist realists as well. And so it's not like you can't get any valid insights from the way that language functions. And so, sure, I think that he has some work. I think his writing is very much worthwhile. And I think that the 20th century move to language is one that often relied on, I think, false presuppositions, but also bore some good fruit too. There's some interesting conversations about the function of language that have happened that should have happened. But then you get the rise of post-structuralism, which moves in a pretty different direction on the foundations of what Saussure was doing. And the primary post-structuralists, I mentioned Roland Barthes and then Jacques Derrida, Foucault as well. But Foucault is really more concerned with history than he is language per se, in the same way that someone like Derrida would be. So with Derrida and Roland Barthes, you get two very kind of parallel thinkers that are moving in very similar directions. They're not mutually interdependent upon one another's systems. It's not like one is just building on the other. So Roland Barthes sees reality as essentially constructed by language, similar to what Saussure does, but he is going to say that all language is inherently political. And so for Barthes, all of reality is politics. And so then he goes on to make some distinctions in the kinds of language that people use. And he's going to say essentially that all language is couched in ideology, which is politics. And it's kind of language is just an excuse to hide your political views. But he says, but there's one kind of language that's not that, one that's not fake. And that is revolutionary political language, because that's admitting that it's political. So essentially, he has just de facto made an argument that any conservative political language is just false on its face.
Yeah.
Right. Without making an argument for it, the assumption is that only the most radical revolutionary leftist language is valid language.
There's a lot of implications for that other discourse. But you'll have to get your book to read about those implications. That's so helpful. That's really interesting. And there are a bunch of other questions I could ask. If you have time for just one more, that's not content wise, but just I think I hope people get a sense of like what I think this would be a really significant book for helping Christians interact with culture today to understand where some of these ideas come from. What would be your plug to our audiences for this book and this book's ability to equip them both in cultural discourse or ecumenical discourse or whatever sort of sphere of public engagement belongs to them?
Yeah. So, this book is different in that it is not written as a theological textbook, and it's not written as a theological evaluation of any of these figures. So it's not really meant just for those who are interested in theology per se, but those are, at the same time, those who are engaged in those fields are people that I have in mind, obviously, as I'm writing this, like I do with anything else. And I think what is in this book, the ideas of these thinkers, these are things that affect every single field of study. Every field of study. They are things that affect the way that people in popular culture talk about themselves, talk about the world, talk about values, talk about ethics. And too often in our conversations, we tend to focus on surface level issues. And I think Christians were very bad at this in the 20th century, unfortunately. And which is part of the reason why I think a lot of people have gone to Rome. Let's be real, Protestants have been way worse about this in the 20th century. Because Rome reaffirmed its Thomistic ideas and system. And yes, there are plenty of moves away from traditional Thomism in the 20th century too. So it's not like it's just that. But uh, at least there is a structure of how we think about reality and how we think about ethics and those kind of things. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, a lot of scholarship in general in the 20th century among Protestants or others has just moved away from systemic, dogmatic, or philosophical thinking. And so when it comes to cultural issues, we just deal with things on an issue by issue basis.
Yeah.
So if you're, say, dealing with the transgender issue, well, as a Christian, you might just be like, okay, well, let's look at the Bible verses that deal with the topic of male and female. Well, obviously, you should be doing that. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't be doing that, but you're also not getting at the real root of the issues.
Yeah.
Because there are deeper, like metaphysical issues.
Yep.
So and I know we get a chance to talk about this, but one of the themes that I use, maybe the primary theme throughout the book, is the notion of the soul.
Yep.
And in so many ways, it is the loss of the conception of the soul that underlies all of these moves.
Yeah.
And like, if you don't have a consistent view of human identity as something that is self-persistent, that is not merely, a construct of language or politics or whatever, then you really can't buy into a lot of modern ideologies, because they're dependent upon certain assumptions about what the human being is.
Yeah.
And so my hope with this book is to get people to think about the deeper issues, to say, okay, what is a human person? What is a human being? What is reality? What is the function of language? And if you understand those things, then you'll be prepared to deal with whatever issues come up in the future. And I think this is the problem, is that if we don't have a clear system of thinking about ourselves and about ethics, then we're always thinking in a reactionary way. Oh,
Yep.
the culture has a new issue, so I got to find it. What is the Christian response? Like AI we're dealing with right now. Oh,
Yep.
what's the Christian response to AI? Social media. We did nothing with social media. But because we have not retained a strong structure
Yeah.
that is needed to really think on a deeper level. And if we can do that, especially if you're thinking through the assumptions of the world in the broader academy, well, then whatever issues come up are going to be evaluated in light of a series of commitments that we already have. So we
Yeah.
have the categories to think and critically about these things.
Yeah, that's great. That's super helpful. Well, again, the book is The Makers of the Modern Mind. I'm going to put an Amazon link below. Thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Cooper. This has been a joy.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun.
All right. God bless.